Hello, good evening and welcome to BizFirst Review 360, your weekly roundup of the top business news and developments impacting the economy. This week has been interesting to say the least. It began with the announcement of the recommendations of the Presidential Committee that was appointed to look into the CITEM issue. Their recommendation, their key solution, was that the medical faculty at CITEM should be abolished and transferred to a not-for-profit entity. That raised several questions regarding the future of individual rights and liberties in our society. Also this week, the Constitutional Assembly was in session. That lit up the political arena. And we also discovered that the Prime Minister would be summoned before the Presidential Commission of Inquiry on bond issuances. We'll also be in conversation on the show tonight with Ravi Ratnasabapathy of the Advocata Institute regarding state-owned enterprises and what we should hope for from the government in Budget 2018. We have all this and more coming up on the program tonight. First, a look at our top stories this week.
The purpose of the Foreign Exchange Act No. 12 of 2017 will be to provide for the promotion and regulation of foreign exchange, to vest the responsibility for promoting and regulating foreign exchange in the central bank as the agent of the government, and to provide for matters connected. The new act, according to legal experts, has further relaxed foreign exchange regulations in the country. However, the essential regulations and guidelines regarding this act have not been publicized and have not been debated publicly. Speaking to News First, the former chairman of the Ceylon Chamber of Commerce, Chandra Jayaratne, said matters that were raised by civil society and media have not been included in the act.
The ego-minded government of this day, who thinks that the ministers in governance know better than institutions and institutional executives, have taken the powers that were formally vested in the central bank and as a regulatory authority, and now most of the transactions, most of the penalties, most of the enforcements are subject to either the minister's guidelines, minister's approval, minister's information, minister's concurrence, and the minister doing some actions which will lead to those provisions being enforced under certain conditions.
Mr. Jayaratne, providing an example, said a person who brings into the country undeclared money worth $1 million will only have to pay 1%. If the value of the undeclared amount is over $1 million, that 1% too will be waived off according to the new act.
And if you bring over $1 million or any money and invest it in development bonds, you are also exempted from the fee. And once invested into development bonds, you can freely take it away. Black money made white. What is this government trying to do?
The World Bank, releasing its second development update on Sri Lanka for 2017, said the island needs to improve physical and financial resilience to natural disasters to better manage its impact on the economy. Sri Lanka is increasingly becoming vulnerable to recurrent natural disasters, which are increasing in frequency and severity. According to the World Bank, on average, the impact of natural disasters on infrastructure, agriculture and relief aid is estimated at 50 billion rupees, which is equivalent to 0.4% of Sri Lanka's GDP or 2.1% of government expenditure. The drought in 2016 and 17 affected approximately 2 million people across 17 districts. It also contracted the agriculture sector, giving rise to inflation. Because of the prolonged drought, rice production in 2017 is expected to be the lowest in the last 10 years. The drought also resulted in more food and petroleum imports. Against this backdrop, the World Bank said better disaster risk management must be an integral part of Sri Lanka's growth model.
If the impact of natural disasters could have been mitigated better. Now, if we zoom in on those natural disasters, we actually see that they do have a widespread impact. Fewer fiscal shocks and a more stable macroeconomy. It's important to be better prepared. It's important to prove physical resilience, meaning identify where the risks are and then act on them by building climate resilient infrastructure and improve the physical response time of natural disasters. But similarly, it's important to be financially resilient, meaning it shouldn't affect the budget execution and your priority spending. It's important to have a layered approach to disaster risk financing. Your budget can deal with small disasters, but for big disasters you can buy international reinsurance, you can issue catastrophe bonds, and you can benefit from contingent credit lines, whether commercial or from the international community. Having a fast disposal mechanism post-disaster, a recovery plan after floods and disasters, and buy catastrophic risk insurance.
Against much debate over the proposed free trade agreements with China and India, the chair of the Global Economy Program at the Lakshman Kadurgama Institute, Dr. Ganeshan Vignaraja, said the FTA with China is clearly political. He made these comments while delivering the lecture, A Recovering Global Economy, the Dynamics of China and India in the Future of Global Growth.
We should attempt to first try to get these two trade agreements done. And in terms of sequencing, for me, the one with China, I think, is the obvious one, because my sense of it is that is a political agreement. It's not an economic agreement, and you don't negotiate with China if you're a small country in the way we are, and China being the large market. It would be an everything but arms agreement, and we should ideally get access for 10 years before China comes and gets access to our market. And one hopes that that's what's being discussed, with a lot of special and differentiated treatment plus a trade adjustment bill. Yeah? If we get an agreement with China, I think we will get an agreement with India rather quickly for obvious reasons. So we should set out our stall in a very clear way, but the Chinese agreement to me is a very clear political agreement.
Everything But Arms is an initiative of the European Union under which all imports to the EU from the least developed country are duty-free and quota-free with the exception of armaments. Dr. Vignaraja said with increased maritime activity in and out of Sri Lankan ports, the Chinese would like to see a set of rules for international maritime management in the Indian Ocean.
They would want a rules-based order because they're major investors in the future in Sri Lanka. And that is what is in for them. So that would be the way I would attempt to do it. And then the aid, of course, would be the other part of the engagement. And China is already here, as we all know, in the port in Hambantota, and they're offering a lot of technical assistance. We should take it, and I think we should try to manage that as best as we can.
Speaking at the forum, Deputy Minister of National Policies and Economic Affairs said the government is taking the initiative to reach a consensus among regional players to make maritime trade in the Indian Ocean safe and efficient.
The key is to leverage the opportunity we have as really the center of the Indian Ocean, leverage our relationships with China and India and the rest of the world, and see how we can balance these two forces and do it in a way that is most beneficial to us. We have to be selfish of our own interest. That's what comes first. So in doing that, obviously, we have multiple questions that are being asked. And how do we genuinely deal with those fears? How do we ensure that China doesn't use our ports as a military bases? How do we make sure that if Chinese subs show up in our ports, that it happens in a way that is acceptable to the global regional community? Or else, how do we make sure that our friends are able to utilize our ports for both commercial and sort of R&R, others for military purposes? As you know, we had the USS Nimitz, the world's largest some aircraft carrier, docked here. We saw in Hambantota the Japanese, Indians and the Americans together in our ports in Hambantota. So it's a challenge for us, but I think that's also the opportunity for us. We'll take the lead to explore the possibilities of looking at some sort of rules-based order in the Indian Ocean, so that no one is denied access and everybody's cargo, everybody's commercial transactions are safe and are done at the lowest possible cost.
Helped by the Chinese-run deepwater terminal CICT, the Colombo port has moved up 2 places to rank as the 25th busiest container port next to Vietnam's Ho Chi Minh City. In 2016, Colombo's volumes grew 10.6% to 5,734 million 20-foot equivalent units, helping it overtake Port Bremen in Germany and Port Tanjung in Indonesia in the ranking of top 100 container ports by Lloyd's list. Lloyd's publication says the significant rise in volumes came as a result of an influx of ultra-large container ships calling Colombo International Container Terminal, situated in the port's new South Harbour development project.
Stay tuned to Biz First Review 360. On the other side of this break, we have Ravi Ratnasabapathy from the Advocata Institute. Welcome back to Biz First Review 360. In just over a week from today, the government will present its budget for 2018 in Parliament. What can we expect from this budget? What should the government really be focusing on in this budget? To talk about this, of course, the budget, and more broadly on the current state of the economy in Sri Lanka, we're joined by Ravi Ratnasabapathy from the Advocata Institute, a liberal policy think tank. Ravi, thank you very much once again for coming on Biz First Review 360. Let me ask you straight, what do the current macroeconomic indicators tell you about the state of Sri Lanka's economy?
Right. If we just look at the latest macro figures that we have, we see tax revenue growing by about 19% up to July. Expenditure is up about 13%, so we see the deficit narrowing. It's not in line with the target, which is a surplus by the end of the year, but we are a little below. But given the fact that we had a drought, we had a flood, about 1.9 million people were affected in that. Given all those issues, on the tax and fiscal side, the performance has actually been, we would say, quite satisfactory. The result of that, we can see the exchange rate slowly stabilizing. Interest rates are also beginning to fall. Thanks to GSP Plus, we are seeing exports picking up 7.6% up.
With this budget that's coming up and towards achieving the government's Vision 2025 target of making Sri Lanka an upper middle income country, how should the government go about dealing with state-owned enterprises?
Right. State-owned enterprises have a structural problem inherent in the way they are organized. Whether it's here, whether it's in other countries, they have the same problem. It's the problem, if you like, what we refer to as the problem of agency. Now, if you're looking at a sole trader, a businessman, somebody who's running his own business, right? He is spending his time and his money running his own little business, right? Everything he does is, he and the business are one and the same. They spend their time and effort doing their best to improve the business. Now that way, all his efforts are directed, his interests and the interests, because he is the owner and the manager, the interests are aligned. Now when you get into a slightly larger form of business, like a company, right? The company has many shareholders who can't all be involved in management. So you have appoint a board of directors who represent the shareholders. Now the shareholders need to hold the directors to account. Now this creates the problem of agency. How well do your agents, your board of directors manage the affairs of your company? Now the board themselves will appoint other officials under them. But if you are a listed company, the stock exchange is monitoring you, the SEC is monitoring you, the shareholders have the right to see the annual accounts, to meet the management at a annual general meeting, to ask questions. So this is where the issue of corporate governance comes in.
You're saying this is absent in state-owned enterprises?
Now, in state-owned enterprises, you have an actual a third layer of management, because the institution is technically owned by the public. It is run by appointed officials and who report to politicians. So now, instead of the shareholder appointing the directors who run the company,
you have that level of
you have an additional level, and the additional level, the politician has absolutely no interest in serving the members of the public. He is the one to whom the directors of the enterprise must report, but he has no particular interest.
So let's talk about Sri Lankan Airlines for a bit. Sri Lankan Airlines, one of the biggest state-owned enterprises in terms of liabilities, at least right now. There is talk of a possible PPP, public-private partnership, with Qatar Airways. Is this a positive step? Will this help alleviate the burden on the Sri Lankan government?
Yes, definitely. If the airline can be sold or disposed of in some way, or at least the liability is taken off the public, that would be a positive step. We need to ask ourselves, as I said earlier, the government has no resources of its own. They are dependent on what they can collect from the public in the form of taxes or what they can borrow. How do you want to utilize these resources? Do you want to run an airline, or should you be instead providing health services or education or something else? It's a question of how you allocate your resources. So running an airline, to me, is not really a priority, and I don't think it is a priority for the great majority of these of the people in the country. It is a big prestige project to do, but does it really provide value, and do you really want to sustain these losses?
Do you think it's that easy? Just liquidate Sri Lankan Airlines? You know, let the government out of it completely?
Right. Yes, a good question. It is indeed, it's a very high profile thing, and shutting down an airline would be a dent in your pride. But at the end of the day, you need to really ask yourself the question, and the voters and the members of the public really need to ask themselves the question as to what their priorities are. If we look at the food taxes, which Advocata, we did a small tabulation earlier, the amount the government revenue that was raised through the special commodity levy, which is basically most of the food taxes, was about 54 billion rupees last year. They spent about 55 billion on the losses of the largest, just the largest. I don't know about the others. There were 55 that the government public enterprises department tracks. 55 billion was the combined loss of those state enterprises. Now, you could have cut your taxes on food to zero if those losses had not been there. So now the question is, Air Lanka was 28 billion, or half those losses. So 40 rupees a kilo on potatoes, 40 rupees a kilo on gram, 30 rupees a kilo on sugar, 50 rupees on canned fish. There's those taxes on food actually were amongst the other taxes that actually paid for some of these losses. So if you ask and see how many of your rural people from Sri Lanka, or even people in the urban area, how many of them are flying Air Lanka or benefiting from having this airline, and how many would benefit really if you were able to reduce the taxes on your food. So it's a question that money doesn't really grow on trees. The politicians might tell you that, but that is not the case. And if they print money, which is what was done last year, you see the effect of the on the exchange rate, and ultimately you're suffering in the long term. So people are, to come back to the bigger question of the macro picture, the macro situation is stabilizing, but it has come by the taxpayer being forced to cough up really, and they've also lost out on the exchange, which was how part of the deficit was financed in 2015 and part of 2016. So at the end of the day, The public are the people who pay.
Yeah, on that note, I'd like to stop you there, Ravi. We're going for a short commercial break. When we come back, we'll be talking about doing business in Sri Lanka. Welcome back to the program. We're in conversation with Ravi Ratnasabapathy of the Advocata Institute ahead of the Budget 2018 speech in Parliament. Ravi, when talking about the economic indicators for Sri Lanka, what would you say about investor confidence? I mean, you've seen this, the interest expressed by Qatar in Sri Lankan Airlines. The government talks about other projects that are in the pipeline in terms of public-private partnerships. When looking at the current climate, what would you say about investor confidence?
I believe now the macroeconomic fundamentals, if you look at inflation is rising a little bit, but the exchange is stabilizing, interest rates are stabilizing, policy seems much clearer. We don't have ad hoc measures being put in all of a sudden. We don't have ad hoc statements being made. Overall, confidence, I believe, is recovering, which is very important. You see it also in the stock market. I think foreign participation is about 76 billion versus 50 billion in the same period last year. I would say confidence is recovering now.
And that view has been expressed by many economists as well. However, in the World Bank's 2018 doing business report, Sri Lanka has actually gone back from 110th to 111th, while India has jumped forward to 30th space, jumped forward by 30 ranks. There's something that I don't quite understand about how the World Bank calculates these indices, because Sri Lanka, for all, no matter how you perceive it, the climate of, let's say, freedom, as the government likes to call it, is more prevalent now than it was back in 2014. But in 2014, Sri Lanka ranked higher on the Doing Business Index. When it comes to business, is it just idealism that we're talking about when we talk about these different indicators like policy consistency and the need for there to be structural reforms? Some of the policies that the Advocata Institute itself is asking for, or is it just that you need an iron fist? Is that what the Doing Business Index is really looking
at? No, I don't think you need an iron fist, but what you do need is consistency and stability, a certain predictability. You know, business really hates surprises, so you need to avoid all sorts of ad hoc short-term measures, plan carefully, don't fall into crises and then try to bail yourself.
One final question. What is the realistic approach? Now, you've identified the problems that exist within the bureaucracy, the government in meddling in commercial affairs with state-owned enterprises. You've identified the problem. What's a realistic approach that the government can adopt to ensure its continuity, and what's a sustainable solution that the government can adopt to make these reforms?
First of all, I would say you need to review your tax policies and tax much more smartly. There are certain, we have high tax rates but low tax compliance because there are black markets that have emerged because of the high rates. Now, sometimes lowering rates can end up with better compliance and a better overall collection. So, in certain instances, lowering tax rates can bring you greater revenue collection and at the end of the day, lower consumer prices. So, that trick you need to be able to identify and master. That is one aspect. The second I would say is there is a lot in terms of waste, a lot in terms of mismanagement that is happening. It's in the procurement, it's in the capital expenditure. You need to really crack down on that. The Public Accounts Committee really needs to function very effectively. The Auditor General really needs to keep a sharp eye on the state enterprises. You can cut waste and losses and transfer that in terms of lower taxes to consumers or better services. So, for example, your medical services or your education, you can do more with the existing resources if you spend better, spend more wisely. So, there's a lot of fat. When we talk of corruption, that is money taken from taxpayers and pocketed by politicians and their business partners. So that money needs to work for the people. It shouldn't go into other people's pockets. So crack down on that and either give it back to the public in terms of lower taxes or better services.
Ravi Ratnasabapathy, thank you very much for coming on BizFirst Review 360. As always, it's a pleasure. So there you go. The government needs to learn how to tax smart, spend wisely, and crack down on corruption. Ravi Ratnasabapathy's hopes ahead of the Budget 2018 speech coming up in just over a week in Parliament. BizFirst Review 360, of course, will be following the budget very closely, and we'll have a comprehensive roundup for you after the budget is presented in Parliament. Don't forget to look us up on Facebook. You'll find us at BizFirst Review 360. I'll see you again, same time, same place next week. Good night.